Globalization, risk or opportunity? We have complete analysis. This is Global Talk on DW. I'm Sarah Kelly. We are coming to you today from the Post Tower in Bonn, Germany. Globalization is impacting the lives of many. Is it a good thing or should we be concerned? Who are the winners and the losers? And what might globalization look like over the next century? We will try and answer some of those questions for you. So let's get straight to the introductions. Frank Appel is the CEO of Deutsche Post DHL Group, the world's leader in global logistics. He says that globalization is a powerful engine for peace and for prosperity. Witold Orlowski is a member of the Polish Prime Minister's Economic Council and Chief Economic Advisor to PwC in Poland. He is director of the Warsaw University of Technology Business School, and he says that his country has benefited enormously from globalization, but that it needs a new set of rules. Josef Janning is a senior policy fellow at the European Center of Foreign Relations. He researches how globalization impacts people, society, and governance. He will tell us what globalization may mean for democracy and also for our security. And we'll get the social view from David Brady. His work focuses on globalization impacts on poverty and social policy. He is a director at the Berlin Social Science Center for Inequality and Social Policy. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. And I want to begin with the state of globalization right now. Frank, your company, it operates in many countries. Globalization is a key element of your business. In fact, every year you release what's called the Globalization Connectedness Index. What is the state of connectedness today?
The world is more connected than it was. That after the financial crisis, it dipped quite a bit and has recovered and is now again starting to more globalize again. But if you look into some facts, if you guess how many calls are really cross-border, it's only 2%. So Tom Friedman, wow, I think, is not right saying the world is flat already. I think we still have a lot of fences and barriers, and I think we are still at the beginning of a journey to really create a flat planet. So there's a long way to go, but I think we are on the right journey.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot of room to grow, but even despite that fact, Josef, you say that globalization is taking place at the moment at a pace that is far too quick and that we're not equipped to deal with it. Why is that?
Well, it's not too quick in economic terms or financial terms. I think business actors have adjusted to the pace. The problem is that societies don't react that fast. Societies take a longer time to adjust to new realities. Politics takes a longer time to find the ways to deal with it, to find out what needs to be regulated and what not, and how to do it in an increasingly borderless political environment, while the political organization is very spatial, is very territorial. So that will take more time, and as the speed continues, politics needs to catch up.
Okay, so politics has a little bit of room to grow.
Mm-hmm. I guess the tough thing with that, though, is that if politics have to catch up, it's, what's the politics going to look like? I don't see the EU being small. I don't see the EU or the IMF being, failing to catch up. I see them driving a lot of the global trends. The problem is when we see this sort of transnational governance, it looks very different than domestic governance. And I think that the sort of politics we see in the IMF and the EU, which are extremely powerful, perhaps ahead of some of the global developments, they don't seem to be very responsive to citizens in the way that domestic politics has to be.
And now, David, when we talk about globalization, what exactly are we talking about? Because when we were talking before the show, you said, this is a term actually that's misused by some.
Yeah, it's not helpful if we call globalization some sort of vague buzzword, some catch-all. If we sell books with the term globalization in it, what have you, that's not very helpful. I think it's helpful to be concrete and to think of it as multidimensional.
So what is it and what isn't it?
It's economic, meaning trade, investment, people. It's cultural, which is the most difficult to measure, but probably reflects communication, education, diffusion of knowledge, and it's political. And it's these sorts of transnational institutions. And I think we understand them differently. And they are linked, of course they're linked, and it's hard to say which causes which, but I think those are the helpful three pillars of globalization that we see in play these days.
Okay, and we'll try and explore all of them.
May I disagree?
Immediately. You may disagree, and I also want to know from you, what has globalization meant for your country?
No, but first of all, disagreeing, right? I mean, it's more interesting. For me, globalization is not the trade, it's not the investment. Globalization is the state of minds, right? I mean, there is a market, and at the moment when people start thinking, the business people, for example, that why should I think about my market as my domestic market? Why shouldn't I think about the whole world? Why shouldn't I think as a production side only about my country? Why shouldn't I think about in the global horizon? And the same with the investment, the same with the people. So basically, I guess that, and coming back to the point about the institutions that are not up to the level of, if you agree with my definition that the state of mind has changed, that people, basically in our own actions, we started to treat the whole world as a one side. Then the institutions must adjust to this. If the institutions do not adjust, then there's start to be a problem, right? And we see a lot of the problems like that. You asked me about my country or the region I come from, Central Europe. We benefited a lot from the globalization. I mean, we are the happy kids of the globalization. Yeah, I mean, obviously there are some people who are unhappy, but basically this is the region that benefited. But I know very well that there are regions that have got much more of the question marks about this. Especially the problem appears first when there are nations, groups that think they do not take the benefits like the other, they are losing. And secondly, if it is against, if it's going too fast for them.
Absolutely,
Right?
absolutely. And you know what? I actually want to ask Frank, because I thought this was really interesting what you just said. Globalization is a state of mind. Frank, you run a huge company. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I think, and in combination even with what Joseph said, is really interesting. You know, I sometimes say, for me, an employee in any country of the world is equally important than in the country of our head office here in Germany. So if you say that to a politician or to the press or to an employee here, say, what do you mean? I say, I mean that they are equally important. You know, I don't differentiate between a Chinese, an American, a South African or German. They all work for our company successfully. And that is a global mindset somehow
that seems
for me.
implausible.
And it's
compensation
difficult.
differs dramatically across countries. You're not paying the delivery drivers the same in Germany as you are in South Africa.
Of course not. Of course.
So they are treated differently.
They are treated differently because the environments are different, but they are equally important for our service quality and what they do. And therefore, we see them as equally important for what we provide to the customers. Of course, the environments are different, regulations are different. But if I think about what we do here, and we are not, we are not moving jobs across border because we want to move jobs cross border. We really need them there locally because otherwise we can't provide the global service.
Witold, do you agree with that? Because, I mean, there are many multinational companies that are operating in Poland. Do they have the same set of standards, as Frank just mentioned, for their Polish workers as the workers in their domestic economy?
Sometimes one can see that, okay, what you said is excellent. I mean, the world should look like that, right? The truth is that sometimes it's not true. I mean, the companies do know where is their home, do know where are the places when they are the guests. Sometimes, if you say that the basic choices between kinds of concentrating on the short-term profits and building the long-term firm value with a good citizen, corporate citizen, so on, so on, so on. Then one should say that it is a common thing that outside the home country, the companies are much less good corporate citizens and much more profit-oriented. In my country, I must say, we are not the extreme case. We see some elements of this, but clearly there are some quite unpleasant stories about the companies doing somewhere in Asia, in Africa, things that they want to hide, actually, in their own country.
That's an important question if you talk about standards, because that's a challenge I hear quite often. And we should not forget, Europe was not always the Europe what it's now. And some countries are 100 years behind us from the development stage. And if we create jobs in these countries and pay them on local standards, well, we help them that these companies become better countries, because you give people a perspective, they can grow, they can earn more money. If you would say we have to transfer everything from a very rich country like Germany to these countries, we would kill the business immediately instead of trying to raise the standards over time. Germany or Europe was not always like it is now. Even 20 years ago it was different. Poland was 25 years very different from now. And I think we can't move immediately from the standards we have here to have these standards everywhere. I think we can make a journey and improving by offering on local terms fair jobs and good working environments.
Now, you have a corporate social responsibility program. Do you think that some of the biggest winners have been large companies like your own?
I think the world overall was the winner, I believe, because if you look now into statistics, in which shape the world is now in 20 years ago, 50 years ago, I believe the world through globalization has made a great progress. I always say, after the Second World War, the globalization was the peacemaker for the world. It was not politicians, it was not companies, the globalization, because you don't try to have war with your neighbor if you have heavy investments there. And therefore, it has helped tremendously. The EU is a perfect example. The extension to the Eastern Europe is a perfect example. How much free trade, how much globalization we has helped to create a more peaceful country. We sometimes believe we live in a difficult situation at the moment. We should not forget where we come from and how much better the planet is now. And that is thanks to globalization.
But would you say that the winner of globalization has been these large multinational companies?
We have been winner, but many people who work for our company, our customers, think about all the jobs which have been created for globalization. There are millions and millions of winners and very few, if any, losers. Because if you adapt the local environment, even the European countries do very well still, and their living standards are still high.
Do you think that small companies have lost out?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's big, small companies. I think it's more the distribution of resources even within the big corporations. So the problem isn't that there are big corporations like DHL that are winning in globalization. That's good news. I agree with you. This creates job growth in developing countries. But the problem is when the revenue comes back, it's distributed very poorly in rich countries. So the rise of the top 1% in the United States, the global financial elite, that distribution of compensation doesn't reflect productivity. It's not very efficient. And so that's been a dilemma, is that I agree with the premise that globalization has led to job growth. It's been good for many firms, small and large. But the problem is even within firms, the distribution of compensation has been dramatically out of whack.
And I want to bring in a quote, actually, because this is a quote from Jimmy Carter. He said this back in 2002. If you're totally illiterate and living on $1 a day, the benefits of globalization never come to you.
I don't agree with that.
Does that still hold true today? And
no,
I'm going to point that to Joseph.
No, I don't think so. Because the process now has expanded. Half of the world's poor live in India and China. And they indeed have made progress. Middle classes in both of these countries have been growing, and middle class is a very important building block of a fairer society, of a more just a society that is governed by the rule of law. And it has helped to take a lot of people out of poverty. It has had great costs, social costs, environmental costs, infrastructure costs. So there's enormous job to do to kind of organize the public space. But as Frank has been saying earlier, look at Europe in the 1860s, 1870s. We have built the level of wealth we enjoy now, not on perfect standards, but once we've got there, once the process was rolling, there was enormous pressure on decision makers, on elites, on policy makers, to then regulate, to then build a welfare state, to level standards, to control the pollution and everything.
But is that a case that can really be extrapolated? Because, I mean, Europe, it had a shared history already. There were democracies here.
Well, when industrialization began, it wasn't so democratic. It took us a while. It took us a while to build this kind of integration, these inclusive societies that we, by and large, have today. And that's still not happening to the same degree in many other parts in the world. I agree to that. And still, the fact that you have 200 million middle-class Indians today doesn't mean that there isn't great and striking poverty in other parts of the country. There is simply no way at hand for policymakers or civil society actors to solve it all at once. They just need to not only keep the economic ball rolling, but to keep the social ball rolling alongside.
Right.
That's the hard part.
I mean, I guess
Witold, I want to ask you, because you've mentioned that your country has really benefited enormously from globalization. Is there a segment of the population, though, that has been left behind?
Yes, obviously. And, well, always, if you've got a fast change, right, even if it's good change for good, you've got always people that are left behind. It's absolutely clear. You don't have to ask for the globalization. I mean, you've got the development of the big modern trade, and there are small shop owners who may lose on this. I mean, it's always the story. I mean, the change always has got some groups that are, especially those ones that cannot adjust. And that's, in a sense, more of social than the economic problem. I fully agree with Frank that basically, obviously, the globalization is a benefit for everybody. But those ones who cannot adjust easily, who are unable simply to do it, may lose on this. Well, the interesting point was about the European social model, because in a sense, this is also an interesting story, because the globalization is in a sense forcing even the social model in a rich country like Germany to be adjusted, right? Because in the conditions of the globalization, it's impossible to have the same model that was working perfectly in the 60s, right? So everybody must adjust to it, and if there is no adjustment, if because of some reasons, a country, a society, a group is unable to adjust, then it may lose on the globalization.
David, I think you want to
I'm not sure
ask
if I agree with that. So two dimensions of the debate that are going on. One is this assumption that if we become more global, a social model might be incompatible. But think about the most global countries we've got. They're the small Scandinavian countries that have the most generous welfare states, that have the most engaged social democracies that we have. So small countries tend to have big welfare states, they have social democracy, and they trade a lot. Okay, so I think there's a lot of compatibility.
But you know that they modernized very much. I mean, they've got a big welfare state, but modernized welfare state. They
True,
do
but, but I don't think there's,
Frank,
I don't think there's
I
a
wanna go with
fundamental
you for a response
incompatibility
there.
between globalization and social democracy.
No, but I agree to David. You know, then if globalization gives opportunities for many people, and in the countries who benefit from that, in the developed world, you know, we have to take care of two things. One is that we give everybody proper education, because, you know, the jobs we create here are different jobs when we had 10 years, 20 years ago, and that's the first. And so give everybody the chance to develop his own life. And the second is, I think you're right, we have to keep certain things in balance. So that I'm paying 50% taxes from a very good salary I get is perfectly fine for me, because I understand I live in a country and I make a lot of money, and my salary is mainly funded from the profits we make, not in Germany, but in other countries. But I'm happy to share that with the local where I live. So, and that's perfectly fine. And we have a healthcare system in Germany, which is, you know, funded from the whole society and not just from the rich, and is only available for rich people. So I think you can do certain things, and I think the Western world have to keep that in mind, that if we develop and become richer, that we keep things in balance. And I think that's perfectly right. And that's the challenge for the Western world, because, you know, we become more and more a service industry, and how you keep that balance if a country becomes a service industry or service-driven country more.
And when we shift to the BRICS, for example, to emerging economies, do you think that globalization, that they've really won out of this, or is there the risk of exploitation, for example? Because maybe not everybody realizes that paying 50% of your taxes is for the social good. Perhaps people have more of a short-term profit mentality.
Yeah, I mean, I think East Europe has won some elements of globalization, although there's evidence that the countries that receive the most foreign investment have done the worst in the post-communist era. The big winners of globalization are the BRICS. So, I mean, we can't talk about globalization without India and China. That's half the world's population, most of the world's poor, and they've certainly benefited from being where they were 25 years ago. The losers of globalization are those that are not part of the global trade regime. So would you rather be China, or would you rather be sub-Saharan Africa? And I think it's clear you'd rather be China. The dilemma for us, I think, is that can we see a model where, as China and India globalize, they're going to have the sort of social democratic politics that you saw in Europe? And I'm not terribly optimistic. I mean, China's a brutal regime. India is a hopelessly corrupt quasi-democracy. So you need that sort of political cultivation that existed in Europe with industrialization and globalization. And the dilemma is, I don't see it happening in China and India.
Joseph, you're a political scientist. I want you to respond to that.
And I see it happening. It doesn't happen maybe at the right pace or to the right extent, but look at the Chinese leadership. They are under enormous pressure. Probably, these pressures of a rising middle class here, but still a lot of people struggling, trying to get away from the country into the cities, is probably the major legitimizing force of the single communist party that governs China. But they are now faced with a number of demands, particularly from those middle classes. They want to secure the wealth that they have accumulated. No? They want rule of law, therefore. They want some local participation to some degree. We even have, on the local level, we have now Communist Party members competing with each other for a job in public government. That's not a lot, but
So
Now,
that's,
when we-
that's a beginning.
Joseph, and I agree to that, and I think, corruption is an interesting subject. Europe and the US were significantly more corrupt 100 years ago as well. What changed that? The emerging middle class, because as you said, they worked hard for their money and they don't accept to pay twice for the same, through taxes and then extra tip for somebody. And therefore the biggest enemy of corruption is a rising middle class. And you see that in the Western world and you see that in emerging countries. So what we can do, and that's the reason why I'm always saying, if we create good paid jobs in these countries, we are helping that these countries will get on the right track, because the middle class will demand
Can I
it.
add
But what is
something,
this? Of course.
Can I add some? Because this middle class focus, we should also not lose for Europe. One of the problems we have in Europe and in the United States is that our middle class is shrinking. And the middle class actually is the biggest interest group in our democracy. It's the very rich have other means, and they are sometimes even delocalized because they live here and there. The very poor, their main interest is in benefits. But it's the middle class actually that has this vested interest in building a reliable, rules-based and sound system, because that's what they rely on. And people like Fukuyama...
David, has
in his
the
last
middle
book-
class lost in globalization? Are they the losers of globalization?
Not in China and India. In
Okay.
the United States and Europe, maybe. I think the dilemma is twofold. One is that I don't trust the global political institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the EU to do anything about the governance of these sorts of political institutions in India and China and places where we need to cultivate them. So that's a real dilemma. Second dilemma is that when we've brought resources back to the first world, when the first world has benefited from globalization, it's been very poorly distributed. And so it's been ending up sort of, running to the top 1% at a much higher level than it should, very inefficiently, very, in a very dysfunctional way. And so then you understandably get a lot of political resistance to globalization in rich countries.
Okay.
No,
Bertolt.
but let me disagree with you, David. First of all, let's not blame globalization for everything, right?
Sure.
I mean, the increase of the income polarization in the United States has been caused by the changes in the U.S. taxation over the last 50 years or something like that,
Yeah. And the weakening of
not
labor
by the globalization.
No, I disagree. I think a much more powerful force is the weakening of labor unions and the rise of finance capital, both of which are linked to globalization.
Okay, maybe partly, but partly, although they are the internal thing. My point would be that, obviously, in my view, the middle class, I mean, as Frank said, I mean, whoever is well educated can really bring the benefits of the global. So the middle class is basically, in my view, the first winner on the globalization. Okay, the fact that the middle class can make some errors, making too much debts on mortgage loans, taking too much longer mortgage loans and paying the price for that, that's another story. That's really not the globalization to be blamed for this. But the point is that, in my view, the increase of the middle class is exactly the effect of the globalization.
Yeah,
and that's maybe not as optimistic as Francis Fukuyama was telling in the early 90s, right? That this is the beginning of the world in which we all agree on the same principles, on the same values. But as Joseph said, I mean, we see that the middle class is interested basically in the prosperity, safety, security, so the same things that independently on the philosophical, political system, we all say this is something good for the global economy,
But
for
when
society.
pension funds are rated by global finance, as they
Yes.
were, and that wasn't the failure of the middle class to make good mortgage
okay.
investments.
Okay.
That was a dilemma
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
their pensions, their savings, their equity was squandered by global finance.
There is no doubt that in some areas, for example in finance, there are some question doubts. Well, the economists now ask themselves the question, is the liberalization of the global liberalization of the short-term capital flows good or not? Because we all knew that it's good to liberalize the capital flow, but
Right.
maybe liberalization of this was too
Joseph,
far.
I have a question
step too
for you.
far.
Do you think that the world needs a social governing body that makes sure that globalization is developing in a responsible way, that it keeps corporations and also countries in check?
It may, but I think it will never get one. But it's not. that
Imagine
it's
we
not
live in an
necessary.
ideal world.
Yeah, in an ideal world, I would see networks of social governing bodies. You know, I would see that the higher degree now of shared information then leads actually to the fact that you have policymakers, political interest groups, political parties, societal groups, NGOs actually working on a similar agenda. You know, and you know, if we wait for world government, that's going to be a long way down the line. But if we invest into such processes, in communication, social media, you know, this very dense interaction that is now developing across the world is one way to it. Then we can get functional equivalence to world government through convergent networks which basically pursue a similar agenda and that inform each other, that, you know, multiply each other's effect institutions may have locally.
Frank, I want to talk about your social responsibility program in your corporation. How are you addressing the pitfalls of globalization? You mentioned education earlier. What else are you doing?
Yeah, so you know that's a part of our overall strategy. That we have 3 pillars. We call that Go Green, Go Help, and Go Teach. So, and what we are doing there, we have self-committed ourselves to increase the carbon efficiency of our company because, of course, transportation creates a lot of carbon emission, and we think they have to do something. So we have done that. We committed ourselves to improve that significantly. We made already a long way on that journey. The second is what we call Go Teach, where we really think that we should help children who are coming from underprivileged areas and not from their universities, and therefore we invest heavily in SOS children villages. We have fellowships for our employees' children, and not for the well-paid, for the normal workers. And the third element is that we do something what we call Go Help. When natural disasters are happening, what is not missing is money. What is missing is logistics expertise. And we send our volunteers on the demand of the UN in natural disaster situations. The last big one was on the Philippines, where all bridges were broken, roads were destroyed, and what was missing is logistics expertise, how you bring the goods to the people in need. And this is what our people do, and we are very proud. We have 400 volunteers around the world. They are at any time ready, on demand of local governments and the UN, to be sent in and help in
These are your employees.
These are our employees. Because we have a logistics expertise.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, David, are corporate social responsibility programs like that enough, or do we need more?
They're mostly
And
public.
from whom?
They're mostly public relations. So I don't have any hope that corporate social responsibility is going to solve the world's problems. I agree. The best thing that DHL can do for the poor in the developing world is give them a job. That's the best thing. And beyond that, it's mostly public relations. So I'm not optimistic about corporate social responsibility. If they pay their taxes, DHL pays their taxes and creates jobs in the developing world, they're doing a good thing. And that's the most we can expect.
Okay,
believe
Vitold,
pretty much
from
in
the
the corporate
perspective
social
of your
responsibility.
government, I mean, what is your government doing to make sure that these multinational corporations that are operating in your country have corporate social responsibility programs and that they're operating in a way that is socially responsible?
No, the point is you cannot force anybody to have. I mean, if you are talking about the real responsibility, it must be the real wish of the company rather than being forced. I mean, if somebody is being forced, he can make a fake story out of this. But I would say that I would come back to the Frank's first point. I mean, the education, the good regulation, the social, functioning of the society, of the open society, in which there's a lot of the
And who needs to be
information.
responsible for that?
Well, the government obviously has got its role in this. Well, depending on the country.
But what happens when governments don't do that?
Well, then they should. Okay, well, sorry, that's a simple answer, right? And obviously there is a whole range of the governments from a kind of failed state that do nothing, through the states in which we are living, for example, in Europe, in which information, I mean, the government don't have to run the information. They must make sure that there is a free flow of information, but it's basically done by the society, by the private sector. So depending on the situation, but the education, the free society, the open society, the information, and the good functioning of the markets is probably the key, and the rule of law, obviously.
Yeah, but let me add to both of that. And David, you are somehow right and wrong. You know, what we do on corporate social responsibility is more than PR. I think it's even more important internally than externally. Because, you know, we are a company which have 56 billion revenues, which is equal to the GDP of the 64th largest country. So we are not small. So we have influence. And we asked our people in any country of the world, you know, confidential about their feedback. We train them in democratic systems because they can give us feedback and we don't know what they say, what is the basic of a democracy. If we talk about reduce our carbon footprint, they start talking about that the environment is just more than the surroundings, and they start thinking about it. And we do that in every country. So we are telling people something beyond that we give them a job. We give them more, which we have learned in our company somehow, and tell them something how the world can look like, and that makes a significant difference. And if every company does that around the world, and we are not elected, we are appointed, so we have easier ways to funnel that through our organization. We can collectively make a huge difference as a company, and therefore I think it's more than just PR. But I think it has significant impact on the mindset of our people, which is positive for the countries which we are living in.
I don't have a lot of confidence in corporate firms to do that if it wasn't profitable. I don't think they're going to do that just to do it because they're good people. And that's not in questioning the integrity of these firms. Let's just be honest. These corporate firms are interested in profits first and foremost, understandably. And if it didn't affect their stock price to have a bad reputation, you wouldn't see as much attention to corporate social responsibility. So I just don't have that optimism, that faith in the benevolence of corporations. And that's not, nor in any individual for that matter.
This is, again, somehow right and wrong, of course. And I say that even. We are doing that not because we want to be good. We are doing that because we benefit from that.
Sure.
But on the other side, the countries are benefiting from that as well. We are doing, that's the reason why I'm saying it's not PR, it's more internally.
I want to talk about our vision for the future, what globalization will look like 10 years from now.
On the road to there, we will go through a series of crises, part of which will be economic crisis because of globalization. Because also the business model of globalization will need adjustments. But part of that will be political or social crises. Because it creates enormous pressure on the governance and on the identity of people. And as more parts of the world, as Frank says, will enter into that problem, we will see more governance crises and more identity crisis, or more eruptions of identity politics to hold on to something that people don't want to lose.
Witold, is the economy more vulnerable in a more globalized world?
Well, I guess so. I hope so. I guess with the globalization, we are in a situation of a bike. I mean, either it accelerates, or one can imagine a scenario in which a wave of the new protectionism is really blocking it. But I'm optimistic. I think that the globalization will continue. I hope very much that there will be more agreement that Joseph was talking about, some free segment of the society, free institutional, the state, the business, and the civic society, because a better handling of globalization in some areas, for example, securing some basic social standards of the employment, not the wages, obviously. Wages are different, but the social standards minimal should be the same, and that's something that could stabilize the globalization and help it developing further.
And where does government play into all of this? I mean, how does governance and globalization go together?
I'd say the way the states are going to thrive, succeed in this era of globalization will be investments in education and investments in health. And you look at other winners of globalization, probably the only country to go from being a poor country to a rich country in our lifetime is South Korea. And that's a country that has a very, very strong state.
Taiwan.
So what?
Taiwan.
Taiwan maybe is the second, but it's not clear if they're a country. But I think the tough call is how to be the strategic state that invests in the right investments over the next generation. Those are going to be the big winners.
I would just ask the question, what does it mean a strong state? Because a strong state means an effective state, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't mean necessarily an oppressive state, right? And I would say the better, that's general economic knowledge these days, the better the institutions, the more effective the institutions of the state, of the society, the more likely it is to benefit from the economic growth and from the globalization.
And all of these trade agreements, I mean, is that destabilizing to forming a strong, effective state?
I worry
Frank?
less about the trade agreements than I do about the international institutions like the IMF and the EU. So I think that's more the dilemma we need to worry about when it comes to governance and distribution of revenue, power. I worry more about the IMF.
Frank, you said that globalization promotes peace.
Yes.
Why is that?
Yeah, if I see in our study connectedness, then I see that the countries who have the most connected countries in the world at the current stage have a very high development index and are now really peaceful countries. In the Nordic countries, the UK, Netherlands, Germany, Singapore, they all are very open. That puts them constantly under change pressure, and that's good, and then they are adapting to the changes. And I think if we open borders more, Colombia is a great example. Colombia has changed from one extreme to a fast-growing engine because they opened their borders. They had a proper, government now in place. And you see that if countries are opening, they become more stable countries. The Human Development Index develops, and that's the reason why I believe free trade agreements, the TTIP, the CETA, whatsoever, the TPP, they all will help to make the countries which are participating better countries. And therefore, I'm very optimistic that globalization will create a lot of winners if we continue and create a significantly higher human development index. And that's a prerequisite for having peace. And EU is a perfect example that after the war, which started from this country here, we had peace for so long time, never before in that region of the world, is because we have the EU. And we should never forget that whatever happens at the moment, and we have crisis and with the euro, but the real reason why this region of the world has been so stable and peaceful is because we created a union, and that's terrific, and we should continue to do so.
Witold, can the EU's example be extrapolated? Is globalization a tool for peace?
Yes, although nowadays the EU has shown many shortcomings in the institutional setting and so on and so on. And EU must be improved as well. But I fully agree. I mean, for me, the EU is an example, still not ideally working, but an example how the societies, the nations should cooperate. And I fully agree with what Frank said. I mean, that's and Joseph already mentioned, that's the example that if you start living together, mixing the society, you stop thinking about wars, actually, because you start thinking about some nicer things like going to vacations to another country and meeting friends from there.
There's one caveat, however. The logic of economic interdependence, of incentives and opportunities didn't fully apply to Russia. No? Yeah. Russia had begun to integrate, but is in a way regressing because it's going on a rather nationalist, not an integrationist, not a cooperative political course. So you see that there is no rule without an exemption, or there is not a strong linear process. It's an opportunity. There's a great chance, but it's not a guarantee.
Yeah, I think.
So
that go ahead.
Given the lessons learned by the EU's experience, what lessons can be learned globally?
Well, I agree with what Frank said. I agree. The EU is a success story. We need to give it credit, despite my complaints about their management in Southern Europe. Here's the dilemma, though. I think, are we becoming a world of regions rather than a world of nations that interchange on a more equal footing? Because, we do have regions that are pretty much left out of the global game, and they're the worst off. I agree with your argument earlier. So that's the uncertainty, is that does the EU create sort of a fortress around itself where it creates trade barriers, it creates protection for, certain commodities and prevents trade with some developing countries? That's the uncertainty. Are we going to have a world of regions rather than a world of integrated nation states?
Yeah, but I think if that Europe would start that, they probably would do something what China did 200 years ago. When they felt, this was the rigid country 200 years ago, just when everything was agriculture. Yeah. They closed their borders and said, we are enough of ourselves. They missed the Industrial Revolution. And the world moved on, and Europe and the US became the powerhouse. Now they are adapting to the new world, and now they become again the powerhouse they were. If Europe now says, oh, we want to protect our standards, let's build fences around that, close the doors, sure. We will never, we will deteriorate the standards significantly in a very short time frame.
Fair enough, but a good example would be the rules prohibiting the importing of agricultural goods from, say, sub-Saharan Africa. That really creates a serious disadvantage for sub-Saharan Africa when it comes to the global economy. And the EU protects French farmers, they protect Germans,
David,
and so that's where I'm a little
Right.
nervous.
Vissel, just
But this is
briefly,
exactly
and then
the example of the imperfect institutions within the EU.
Fair enough.
Everybody is saying the agricultural policy of the EU is far from the ideal, and this policy is forcing the EU to block the imports of food from sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay.
So the error is
That's the
within,
uncertainty.
not
Right.
in the
That's the
government.
uncertainty. That's the-
To overcome that uncertainty, because if you are wealthy, you are always concerned that it gets turned in the wrong direction. You start protecting your standards you have achieved. So what Europe needs is a vision what Europe could be in 20 and 30 years. And I think Europe should have a vision to become the first secular economy somewhere, so that you are really thinking about how we live in more balance with the environment and have really social standards which are not just for the people who are now living on that, but also for the people in 30 years, despite that the demographics are changing. I think Europe has an opportunity to create a positive picture. What can Europe achieve with all the power Europe has? But if you don't talk about that, people are concerned that things only will change to the worse, which I think is not the case, but you need a positive picture of what Europe can do.
All right, and speaking of opportunities, we posed a question at the beginning of the show. It was globalization, risk or opportunity? Gentlemen, in just 2 or 3 sentences, risk or opportunity?
It's a huge opportunity, and I think we are unfortunately on the right path, and we will see that we will globalize the world even more to the benefit of many.
Joseph?
It is happening, so it's both a risk and an opportunity, but there's a lot of opportunity also to deal with the risks.
Yeah. The
David?
opposite of a risk isn't an opportunity, but it is both an opportunity and a constraint.
Okay, questioning our fundamental question.
enough.
Thank you, David.
An opportunity with some hidden risk, obviously, that must be taken care of.
Okay. So I think it's fair to say that our guests are cautiously optimistic about the way that globalization is changing our world. That's all we have time for here on Global Talk. My name is Sarah Kelly. Thank you very much for joining us. And don't forget, the conversation continues on Twitter. You can follow me at Sarah Kelly TV. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.